When World War II began, the Islamic world became a battleground of propaganda campaigns. Hitler himself, much like Kaiser Wilhelm beforehand, was actually very keen on Islam, and believed there were some Aryans in the region. For instance, he said, "Here and there one meets amongst the Arabs, men with fair hair and blue eyes. They're the descendants of the Vandals who occupied North Africa." He also believed that Islam brought culture and science to Spain, and claimed had the Franks not stopped their advances, we should, in all probability, have been converted to Mohammedanism, that cult which glorifies heroism and which opens the seventh heaven to the bold warrior alone. Then the Germanic races would have conquered the world. Christianity alone prevented them from doing so. Himmler also tried to find passages to provide Muslims with the basis for the opinion that the Führer has already been forecast in the Quran. Ernst Kattelbrunner couldn't find such a passage, so just settled on pushing forward the narrative that the returned Isa defeats the giant and Jew king Dajjal at the end of the world. Even Hitler said, "I'm going to become a religious figure. Soon I'll be the great chief of the Tartars. Already Arabs and Moroccans are mingling my name with their prayers." So when war was declared, the Nazis began working to forge alliances within the Islamic world. And when the Italians joined in the war, there was real fighting along the borders of Libya and Egypt, splitting the allegiances of Muslims in North Africa. For instance, Idris of the Senussi order promised to support the British, in the hopes that they would chase the Italians out of his country, and he even managed to raise a small force of locals to aid the Allies. While across the border, many Egyptians were trying to rally together groups to support the Italians. One notable collaborator was Anwar Sadat, the future leader of the country. He tried to unite the various groups and use this opportunity to push the British out. He was joined by other members of the Young Egypt Party, like al-Msiri. He had worked with the British during the Arab Revolt, and at this point was on the Regency Council. Yet in 1940, he would be dismissed when the British found documents in his house proving that he had contacts with the Italians in Libya. But many in Egypt feared fascism more than the British. For instance, Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, was said to have received a great deal of funding from the Nazis, but he publicized writings criticizing fascism. Yet then, in Europe, Germany would quickly seize France and set up the Vichy government. With that, Lebanon, Syria, Tunisia, Morocco and Algeria were brought under the rule of this new puppet state. Now the British position in the Middle East was left incredibly weakened. They were fighting the Italians off in Egypt, they had few friends in Palestine, and the Germans and Italians were using Vichy Syria to bomb their positions. Then it was about to get even weaker in 1941, when the Iraqis almost joined the Axis. Here, Sidki had come to power in a coup a few years earlier, but was assassinated. Al-Midfide took over the country afterwards, but, like with his predecessors, often ruled as a military dictator. In fact, the British had quite a large role in creating this problem, as they invested heavily in the army, while leaving other institutions weakened. So nearly every prime minister depended on one of the major generals in the country in order to secure their power. Midfi did have his opponents though. Nouri al-Said, for instance, was another former prime minister who had fled to Britain to escape persecution. He therefore remained pro-British and was able to convince a prominent general, Salah al-Din al-Sabag, to launch a coup in December 1938. But al-Sabag was a strange ally, as he had spent time training in Germany and was one of the generals that formed the Golden Square, which favoured an alliance with Germany. The following year, King Ghazi died in a car crash, and many held Nouri as responsible. Plus, the new monarch, Faisal II, was just a child, so a regent was appointed. This was Abd al-Ilah, and he largely followed Nouri's pro-British policies. However, conflicts outside of Iraq would begin to cause troubles for Nouri. Notably, rebel Palestinians fled to Iraq, including Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. He then met with Iraqi Arab nationalists, further stoking the flames of rebellion. Al-Sabag then withdrew his support from Nouri, forcing him to resign. He was succeeded by al-Gaylani, who had been prime minister before, and was opposed to any concessions to the British. He also then refused to break off ties with Italy, and even sent diplomats to meet with the Germans. An Iraqi shift towards the Axis would be disastrous for the British, as Iraqi oil would fuel the German war effort. So the British responded quickly and placed sanctions on the country. Meanwhile, over in Egypt at Tobruk, The British were able to hold off the Italian advances in 1941, securing their position in the Middle East for now. This allowed the Iraqi region to pressure Gaylani to step down in early 1941. Yet, the members of the Golden Square made plans to reinstall him into power. The regent then discovered these plans and fled, allowing the coup leaders to march into Baghdad on April the 1st and reinstall Gaylani. He quickly refused to allow British troops to pass through his country, which was essential to the fronts in Egypt and also in Greece. So the Secretary of State for India, Leo Amery, sent troops to Basra to challenge this decision. Gaylani, however, refused to budge, so British troops landed in the Habaniya airbase as well. The Iraqi army quickly surrounded the airbase, believing that this would push the British into seeking a diplomatic resolution. But the British just bombarded their positions. At the same time, Hitler issued Order No. 30, declaring, "The Arab freedom movement in the Middle East is our natural ally against England. I have therefore decided to move forward in the Middle East by supporting Iraq." So the Axis powers began shipping in weapons via Syria, and the British sent in another force from Transjordan. This Arab Legion relieved the airbase, and together they marched on, despite Luftwaffe bombardment. They took over Fallujah after heavy street fighting, and the force in Basra was reinforced and they too began to advance. They all marched on Baghdad with initially a small force of only 2,000 men. Fortunately for the British, however, Iraqi intelligence was poor and Gaylani panicked, believing a much larger force was about to enter the capital. He therefore fled to Persia on the 29th of May and left behind a power vacuum in the city. With no government in the city, people began to riot, and over the next 2 days, they began to attack the Jewish people. Jews, by the way, had lived in Iraq for centuries, and made up a considerable chunk of the population of the capital. Yet, it seems that the Zionist issue, along with Nazi propaganda, began to change everything. Anti-Semitic propaganda was broadcast by Radio Berlin in Arabic, while there were some notable fascists in high-ranking positions. For instance, there was Yunus al-Sabawi, who was a member of the ministry. He had actually temporarily declared himself to be the governor of the capital and planned on calling for much larger massacres. These riots, known as the Farhud, saw 200 people killed and considerable damage in Jewish areas. However, there are also numerous instances of Muslims defending Jews from the crowds, sometimes at the cost of their own life. The British then entered Baghdad and brought back the regent and Prime Minister al-Midfai. Order was then restored violently, while many of the culprits, including al-Sabawi, were executed. And although this didn't mark the end of the Jewish community in Iraq, it wouldn't be long before most of them had left. British troops would remain in Iraq throughout the remainder of the war in order to secure their oil, and this marked a turning point in the entire conflict, as now the Axis advance in the region had been halted. Iraq would then be used as a base to launch an invasion of Syria and Iran. So let's start with Syria. This was under the control of Vichy France and was being supplied with Axis weapons. The British, worried that they could soon strike at the Suez Canal, decided to act quickly. The Vichy forces were under the control of Henri Dance and numbered around 45,000 men, while within Syria, the local population were overwhelmingly in favour of the Axis powers. For instance, in 1940, when France was defeated, allegedly crowds in Damascus chanted, "No more Monsieur, no more Mister, Allah's in heaven and Hitler's on earth." Or, like Sami al-Jundi said, "We were racialists, admiring Nazism. Whoever has lived during this period in Damascus will appreciate the inclination of the Arab people to Nazism." And he, by the way, was a follower of yet another new movement in the region. This began around 1940, when Michael Aflaq and Salah al-Din al-Battar founded the Arab Aya movement. They merged with another group founded by Zaki al-Arzuzi to create the Ba'athist Party. This group called for an Arab resurrection and, importantly, was a cross-religious group, as Aflaq himself was a Christian. Their ties to the Nazis, though, have been disputed. Aflaq was previously linked to the Communist Party in France, but he also seemingly read a lot of Nazi literature, like many of the early members. Take, for instance, al-Jundi, who said, "We were the first to think of translating Mein Kampf." He also wanted the tiger as a symbol to excite the imagination of the youth in the tradition of Nazism and fascism, but taking into consideration the fact that the Arab is, in his nature, distant from pagan symbols like the swastika. But then he also argued that Arabs and Jews should come together to an understanding in this world and cooperate in order to re-establish the Arabs' glory and realize the Semitic genius, which is the Judeo-Arab genius. So their messaging was pretty confused. But even the more accepted national bloc emulated the fascists in having their supporters wear iron shirts, much like the Wafd party in Egypt wore blue shirts. One future Ba'athist politician named Akram al-Hurani mocked these men, saying that they were far from a true combat unit. It did, however, take a great interest in the organization's external appearances, its uniforms and insignia for instance, which were in the fashionable Nazi and fascist style that appealed to people in those days. So, emulating the fascists wasn't unique to the Ba'athist party. However, as I'll get onto later, they may well have provided sanctuary to many Nazi members after the war. But all of this wouldn't mean much anyway, as within a month, the Allies invaded Syria and the Free French government took control. Once there, de Gaulle proclaimed that the French would recognise Syrian independence once again, but their troops would remain in the country for the remainder of the war. Yet the Axis still had allies in the region. The deposed Iraqi leader Gaylani had eventually fled to Germany and worked alongside the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, al-Husseini. To many, though, it was believed that the Grand Mufti had the real power. The Germans, on the other hand, had already been active in Palestine. Like in 1941, the Sentinel reported, "Nazi-run guns to the Arabs in Palestine." In addition, Nazi warplanes taking off from Iraq dropped leaflets inciting the Arabs for a holy war against the British and the Jews. And the following year, American intelligence discovered the majority of the Palestinian Arabs was fiercely anti-Jewish and saw in the approach of Rommel an ideal opportunity to murder all Jews, then seize their property. Yet, even within the Zionist camp, some had made contact with the Nazis. Now, I should say that the Zionists were split between the socialists, the centrists, and the revisionists, the latter having fought against the British prior to the war. The leader of the revisionists was Jabotinsky, and he had agreed to stop fighting the British while the war was ongoing, but he had died in 1940. The British, on the other hand, continued to make themselves unpopular among the Zionists by limiting Jewish migration to Palestine with the White Paper. Then the Royal Navy even sent some would-be Jewish refugees back to Europe early on. But Ben-Gurion called for Jews to support the British as if there is no White Paper, and oppose the White Paper as if there is no war. Thousands, therefore, did join in the fight on Britain's side, including one of the founders of the revisionist Irgun paramilitary known as David Ratziel. But others were not so keen, like Avraham Stern. He led a breakaway group known as Lehigh, determined to fight against the British. At one point, they even planned on training up Jews in Poland and invading Palestine by force. But the Nazi invasion of Poland stopped these plans. He continued to believe that there should be no negotiation with the British or Arabs, and recruited many men into his ranks that would later become leaders of Israel, like Yitzhak Shamir, while the other revisionist paramilitary group, the Irgun, was led by another future leader of Israel, Menachem Begin. All of these, the British at the time, described as terrorists. Stern therefore continued attacking the odd British policeman, and in 1941 he sent a letter to the Nazis promising to actively take part in the war on Germany's side, in exchange for their support of a Jewish homeland. Now, obviously this will sound ridiculous to many, but Stern, like other revisionists, had begun to follow some elements of fascism. Lehi publications, for instance, often spoke of Jews being a superior race, and the Arabs were a slave race that should be expelled from the lands. For all of this, he and the revisionists became the target of British police and the more moderate Zionists. In 1942, the British police managed to kill Stern himself and chase most of the other revisionists underground for now. Meanwhile, as for the Mufti, Himmler in particular wanted to use his religious standing to encourage more Muslims to fight for the Axis powers, initially in the Balkans. There, the Germans had created a puppet state in Croatia, but Himmler wanted to utilize the Muslims in Bosnia and even in Albania. The Mufti was also seemingly aware of the Holocaust by 1943, and said Germany has very clearly recognized the Jews for what they are, and resolved to find a definitive solution for the Jewish danger. In one radio broadcast in 1944, he also urged Arabs to kill Jews wherever you find them, for the love of God, history, and religion. In exchange for this support, back in 1940, he demanded recognition and Axis support for a free Arab state, and of course an end to Jewish settlements. He even requested Mussolini recognize his sovereignty of an Arab state, including Iraq, Syria, Palestine and Transjordan, and in return he would later discuss the holy places Lebanon, the Suez Canal and Aqaba. Other Palestinian nationalists like Khalil Sakakini supported the Axis powers, and so too did allegedly over 88% of the Arabs in the region, when asked in an opinion poll at the time. But it should be said that many Arabs in Palestine condemned the Nazis as well. Like the Philistine newspaper reported back in 1934, Nazism is an ideology full of disrespect of all peoples. It glorifies the German, and therein lies a danger. And the Al Ghad paper said, they stand at the side of those who fight fascism. We are not stupid enough to believe the sentence, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Yet, many of the Arabs who volunteered for the British side would defect to join the Axis Arab Legion. This term, the Arab Legion, was used to describe a number of units, like Sonderverband 287, which was mainly made up of Iraqis, Syrians and other prisoners of war. So there was still hope of finding allies in the Middle East, and by 1942 the German invasion of the Soviet Union was underway. It was then that Ribbentrop produced a memorandum called Germany's Advance Towards the Arab World, which laid out their plans. They envisioned that when they moved into the Caucasus and occupied Tbilisi, the exiled leaders would meet and call upon the people to rise up against the Allies. They then march south to Basra and link up with the Japanese. Once this is done, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Yemen and Egypt would remain independent states, and Syria, Lebanon, Palestine and Transjordan would be united into a greater Syrian state. Although Ribbentrop agreed that Italy has political primacy in Egypt. Otherwise, Iraq would then annex Kuwait, while Saudi Arabia would take Oman and the rest of the British colonies in Arabia. Mussolini, though, continued to be split over what to do with the Muslims. On the one hand, he claimed to be the defender of the Muslims, but on the other, he warned Hitler of these plans, saying, I hope we do not live to regret promises you have made to Arab leaders. You do not know them like we do. He then went on to say that the Italians had been betrayed by them in Libya. So to avoid what Ernst Vollmann called the Arab game, other Nazis like Hans Bohler advocated for a total Arab federation, obviously under German influence. Yet as always, other plans were on the table. Hitler still wanted to keep the Vichy French on his side, so giving away Syria and Lebanon would of course go against this. And Hitler said that he would not issue any proclamations on the subject until our troops were in Mosul. The Italian policy in the Middle East also continued to anger Hitler throughout the war, as it presented the Axis as just new colonial oppressors. So, as Hitler said, the Duce's claim to be regarded as the sword of Islam arouses just as much laughter today as it did before the war. Hitler also felt like he missed out on what he called a grand policy toward Islam because of our loyalty to the Italian ally. As for other possible allies in the region, there was Ibn Saud. Even before the war, the Germans had been sending weapons to the Saudis, and in 1938, a foreign policy memo said, Germany's policy in the Near East could be effectively supported through Saudi Arabia, the center of the Mohammedan world. Hitler also received a Saudi envoy, Khalid al-Hud, and declared that they were both fighting the same enemies. The Nazis even compared their current conflict to that of Muhammad when he drove the Jews from Arabia. In 1940, Franz von Papen even suggested that the Mufti and Saudis enter into an alliance and divide up the territories belonging to the British and King Abdullah. A year later, in 1941, the Germans requested Ibn Saud's help in supporting the coup in Iraq. In return, he would be recognized as the king of all the Arabs. But Ibn Saud refused and withdrew his ambassadors. Then there was also Turkey. Here, Hitler, like elsewhere, was deeming anyone he liked as Aryan. We've lost some of our Germanics, the Berbers of North Africa, the Kurds of Asia Minor. One of them was Kemal Ataturk, who had nothing to do with his compatriots from the racial point of view. But elsewhere, he seems to have been particularly fond of Turkic people. Like in the Caucasus, he said he didn't trust creating Georgian units, as the only ones I consider to be reliable are the pure Muslims, which means the real Turkish nations. And as a proclaimed follower of the Young Turks and later Ataturk, Hitler justified some of his own actions, saying, who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians. Geopolitically, though, an alliance with Turkey would secure Germany's borders. As Hitler said himself, The Finns cover one of our flanks, Turkey covers the other. That's an ideal solution for me. But the Allies were also trying to win over Turkey, promising them parts of Syria, the Greek islands, and Bulgaria. But the Germans went further and appealed to those Turks who supported pan-Turkism or pan-Turanism. The Germans allowed these groups to work within the Caucasus, hoping to start a Turkic rebellion in Azerbaijan and maybe further afield in Central Asia, connecting with the Basmachi rebels. Bey Mirza Hayit, for instance, served in the Turkestan Legion and would later write a series of books advocating for uniting Turkic states, including East Turkestan in China. There were, by the way, some Nazi agents, engineers and missionaries working in East Turkestan in the 30s, like George Vassel, but he was arrested by the Soviets. Hitler, however, was unwilling to make concrete promises until Turkey joined the Axis. And once again, it was his alliance with the Italians that hindered his plans. Like even before the war, Sarıkoglu suggested an Anglo-Soviet Turkish defensive alliance. But when Stalin and Hitler made a pact, Inonu realized any Turkish involvement would quickly result in disaster. Yet the Germans kept on trying to pull the Turks onto their side, and one way they did this was by publishing information regarding Operation Pike. This was an Allied plan to bomb Azeri oil fields early on in the war in order to stop the Soviets from fueling the Nazi war effort. Well, the Turks were made aware of this plan, and the Germans revealed this information to the Soviets in order to worsen their relations. The Axis powers then moved south and either took over most of the Balkan nations or aligned with them. So Sarıkoglu was sent to sign a treaty of non-aggression with the Nazis, and the Turks began exporting chromite to them. But the nation still remained neutral. This, however, was not a particularly popular choice, as inside Turkey, a growing number of far-right nationalists were advocating for war. Nihal Atsiz, for instance, rejected Ataturk's idea that the Turkish people were somehow connected with the Anatolian civilizations like the Hittites. Instead, he wanted to almost resurrect a pre-Islamic Turkic culture and unite the various Turkic people around the world, all the while pushing some degree of racial purity. The government did go along with some of his rhetoric, as in 1939, Prime Minister Refik Saydam said he would not accept masses of Jews nor individual Jews who were oppressed in other countries. And in 1942, the Jewish community, like the Christians in Turkey, were hit by the wealth tax. This tax was supposed to raise funds for national defense, but in reality, it struck at the ethnic minorities who still controlled many of the industries in the country. As Sarıkoglu said in a speech, "We have a chance to gain our economic independence. We will abolish all foreigners from our economy and hand it over to the Turkish citizens." The amount of tax each person paid was determined arbitrarily, based on lifestyle and a community average. Sometimes they even forced non-Muslims to pay twice more than they actually earned, while Muslims, on the other hand, only paid around 5%. Many therefore sold everything they had, and if they couldn't pay, they were sent off to labour camps. This was the fate for over 5,000 people, all of whom were non-Muslims, while the state confiscated around $4 billion of assets in today's money. There were also issues the Turkic government perceived with certain Muslim groups. Obviously, the Kurds continued to push for autonomy, but then there were the Circassians. Like the deputy of Eskişehir said, in the past they were preoccupied with selling girls to the palace, now smuggling. Why are we tolerating these nomads who have been horse thieves? The Allies would eventually step in and pressure Turkey to stop confiscating lands, but it had forced many Jews to move to Palestine. To make matters worse, in 1942, they refused to repatriate many Turkish Jews during the war. Though it should be said some individual Turks like Selahattin Ulukumen stepped in to save many. Going back to the Nazis though, as they possibly had another ally in Reza Shah of Iran. The Germans had already been investing heavily in the country, the Iranians were trapped between Germany's rivals, and a German victory could see the Shah potentially take back his lands. As Hitler himself said, if there is anyone who was praying for the success of our armies, it must be the Shah of Persia. Then, in Afghanistan, King Zahir Shah as well allowed the Germans to invest in his country, and he also made requests to annex British land in India should the Germans win in 1941. As he said, justice for Afghanistan would be created only when the country's frontier had been extended to the Indus. So a greater Afghanistan, obviously under German influence, could well have been created. But in the region, the Germans had another possible ally, the Fakir of Ipi. He had long evaded the British, earning the nickname the Scarlet Pimpernel of Waziristan. Well, in 1940, Dr. Manfred Oberdorfer and Fred Brandt were sent to Afghanistan and modern-day Pakistan to try and find him. They may well have supported his plans for creating an independent country for the Pashtuns. However, in 1941, Oberdorfer was killed and Brandt was arrested after a firefight with Afghan troops. At first, though, these nations weren't particularly on the forefront of the war. But just 1 month after the British took control of Iraq, the Germans launched Operation Barbarossa. The British and the Soviets demanded that the Shah break off diplomatic relations with Germany, as they realized that if Iran was to join the Axis, they would cut off the Allies' shipment of arms to the Soviet Union. Plus, they would also open up fronts in Central Asia and the Caucasus, and possibly challenge British India and their control over the Middle East. The Shah, however, refused, so the British and the Soviets coordinated a joint invasion of his country in August 1941. The Royal Navy attacked Iranian ships, and 200,000 Allied troops moved in. The Shah had maybe around 125,000 troops. Yet, despite his modernization efforts, he was still some years off having a completely modern army. The British took the oil fields of Khuzestan and moved on to Kermanshah. At the same time, the Soviets captured important towns like Tabriz and Mashhad, and then the armies merged in central Iran and bombed the capital. At this point, the Shah panicked. He beat generals who tried to make peace with the Allies and forced his own prime minister to resign, accusing him of demoralizing the army. He then appointed Muhammad Ali Foroughi as the new prime minister. Yet he was an old enemy of the Shah, and he quickly worked against him. He met with the Allies and argued that the people wanted to be liberated from the Shah's rule. So the British and the Soviets agreed to halt their advance if the Shah agreed to hand over all German nationals and cut off diplomatic relations with all Axis powers. But because the Red Army would certainly kill the German nationals, the Shah and Foroughi delayed, giving the Germans time to flee. This angered the Soviets, who began to advance once again in September, and when they entered the capital, they forced thousands to flee, including the Shah. His son Mohammad Reza Pahlavi became the new Shah, and he seemed like a good fit for the British, as he spoke English fluently and seemed somewhat pro-Western. But he was forced to rule over an occupied country for the remainder of the war. Elsewhere, though, the Axis powers tried to advance again. For instance, Rommel made his way into North Africa and tried to invade Egypt. There, King Farouk continued to rule over a divided nation, and no prime minister ruled for very long. In this period, they had Ali Mahir Pasha from the Islamist Ittihad Party, Mustafa el-Nahas from the nationalist Wafid Party, and independents like Hassan Sabri Pasha and Hussein Siri Pasha. Also, the British High Commissioner Miles Lampson despised Farouk and constantly advised him to appoint pro-British prime ministers like Hassan Sabri Pasha. However, Sabri died in 1940, and Hussein Siri Pasha came to power next, once again at the insistence of Lampson. He had no real support in the country though, and he also agreed to host the Greek government in exile and broke off relations with Vichy France, all without consulting Farouk. So yet another political crisis ensued, with Siri being forced into resigning. Lampson though needed stability in Egypt as the Axis were advancing into the western borders once again, so he demanded that the king bring Nahas and the Wafid Party into government. He then sent an ultimatum to Farouk saying, "Unless I hear by 6 p.m. today that Nahas has been asked to form a government, His Majesty King Farouk must accept the consequences." Farouk though refused, so Lampson moved and surrounded Abdeen Palace in February 1942. The king was then forced to appoint Nahas as prime minister, and in return he was allowed to keep his throne. Many army officers, like the future leader Nasser, saw this whole thing as a national humiliation. As he said, "I am ashamed of our army's powerlessness." And despite spending lavishly on his palaces, womanizing, drinking, and strangely constantly stealing, this whole event made Farouk more popular in the eyes of the Egyptians. Plus, just as a side note, he was the first king from Muhammad Ali's dynasty that could ever deliver a speech in Arabic. But, on the other hand, he also welcomed exiled Balkan rulers into Egypt, like Peter II of Yugoslavia, George II of Greece, and Zog of Albania, seemingly wanting to re-establish his family's ties with the Balkans. Plus, after the war, a whole dossier was produced detailing Farouk's discussions with the Nazis going back to 1941. He also congratulated the coup leaders in Iraq and warned the Iranians of British and Soviet plans to invade. Farouk also offered his best wishes to the Mufti of Jerusalem and to all those who work with him for the success and victory of the Axis. There were other supposed plans, like the king fleeing to Axis countries, or even bombing Jewish lands in Palestine. But on the field, the British halted yet another Axis assault at El Alamein in 1942, securing the country. Had they lost, though, it's safe to assume that Farouk would probably join the Axis. Yet it should be said, though, that many Egyptians disagreed with Nazism, like Taha Hussein, a famous author. As he described the people in Nazi Germany, they live like a society of insects. They must behave like ants in an anthill or like bees in a hive. And of course, there were a great deal more. Going back to the Mufti, though, after failing to stir up rebellions in the Caucasus, he recentered his focus on Tunisia, and, in his words, wanted to set up a band of Arabs as a fighting force and equip them. They will march to Egypt and other Arab countries. However, almost as soon as he relocated, the Allies opened up another front in French North Africa through Operation Torch, and it is here that we probably find the greatest resistance to fascism in the Islamic world. Under Vichy control, the decree granting citizenship to Algerian Jews was revoked, and a network of labour camps were established all the way from Morocco over to Tunisia. A group of Nazis under Walter Rauff was sent to Africa to wipe out the Jewish populations, using, among other things, mobile gas vans. And it was a sizable population, with Tunisia alone having around 105,000 Jewish people. Most Arabs in North Africa, though, apparently responded to the new laws with what Jacques Sabile describes as glacial indifference. But there were numerous people who stood up against the laws. Many Islamic scholars in Algeria, like Sheikh Tayyib el-Okbi, argued, the Quran says that humans are born brothers, and that Islam does not make a difference between races. True Muslims do not belittle other races. There are also many examples of Algerians providing refuge to Jews, while Algerian nationalist Messali Haj said, lowering the rights of Jews did not increase the rights of Muslims. Or Ferhat Abbas said, your French racism runs in all directions. Today against the Jews, and always against the Arabs. Keep his name in mind for later on. In Tunisia, Ahmed Pasha Bey and his successor Monsef Bey were forced into following the anti-Semitic laws. But again, they did their best to stop mass repression, seeing Muslims and Jews as their subjects. Monsef Bey even warned his officials, if I find out that an Arab informer caused even one hair of a Jew to fall, this Arab will pay with his life. As such, he has been dubbed the protector of the Jews. While prominent nationalist Habib Bourguiba was in prison, he refused to get involved, believing that the Germans had no chance of victory. So, as he wrote, the order is given to you and to the activists to make contact with Gaullist French to combine our clandestine action. Our support must be unconditional. It is a matter of life and death for Tunisia. However, when France fell, he was moved to Italy, where it was hoped he would become a possible figurehead. He was then forced to broadcast messages to the Tunisian people, but never actively collaborated to any notable degree. Then there was Morocco, where King Mohammed V refused to send Jews into ghettos or force them to wear yellow stars. He declared, the Israelites will remain under my protection. I refuse to make any distinction between my subjects. As well as protecting the Jews in their homelands, up to 250,000 North Africans enlisted to fight for the Allies. And, it should be said, 450 Arabs, mainly Algerians, have been confirmed to have been killed in the death camps of Europe. Compare all this, by the way, to the 40,000 Jews who lived in Italian Libya. Many were sent to labour camps where they would either be killed or die in harsh conditions. Like 3,000 were sent to the Sidi Azaz labour camp, where they slept in tents in the desert, or the Giaudo concentration camp, where hundreds died of malnutrition. Then the situation was made worse when German troops took control of the war effort in North Africa. Many Libyan Jews were sent back to Europe to be killed in death camps. Then the Jewish communities here would suffer for many more years, as violence and pogroms continued. There were, however, some in North Africa that were opposed to the Allies, especially the French, like Alal al-Farsi and Ahmad Balefrej, who were living in exile. Balefrej even met with the Germans to discuss the possibility of supporting the Axis. However, as he said to his fellow nationalists, "Do not let yourself take part in the German siren call," obviously seeing the duplicity of their promises. The Vichy government, meanwhile, did have the support of some locals, like the Moroccan Gormiers. But they had also previously fought alongside the Allies at the start of the war, and would quickly switch sides once again. So when the British and Americans planned on landing in North Africa, they had many allies among the local population, and even within the Vichy army. These allies would then take power in the cities before any landing took place. Like in Algiers, a group of Vichy officers, including many Jews, like José Albuquerque, formed the Geogras group. They seized key buildings on November 8th, and then the Allies moved in, facing limited opposition. Sometimes this failed though, like in Casablanca, where the Vichy general was able to stop the coup and call in reinforcements. But the Allies still landed successfully. François Darlan, the Vichy commander in North Africa, had already been captured in Algiers, while his men continued to offer some resistance. So the Allies decided to change plans and shock everybody. Before the invasion, they planned on giving command over General Henri Giraud, but many of the French in North Africa rejected his command. Instead, they gave Darlan power in a deal, if he ordered his men to lay down their arms. Within next to no time then, the Allies advanced on to Tunisia, where the Axis dug in and held out until spring 1943. In the meantime, though, the complicated Darlan affair was resolved when a 20-year-old assassin, Fernand Bonnier de la Chapelle, just killed him. He was supposed to have been a monarchist, determined to bring the Orleans dynasty back to power, but others believe the British, or possibly de Gaulle, were behind the assassination. Giraud therefore took control of the French troops, but he made enemies out of nearly everyone. For instance, he arrested many of the Geogras group, the Jewish officers that helped liberate Algiers. And despite Moncef Bey protecting Jews during the war, Giraud accused him of collaboration and deposed him. He then brought in Mohammed VIII, yet as a ruler, he largely kept out of the public sphere. Giraud also refused to reinstate the decree which made Algerian Jews French citizens. Otherwise, he continued to almost work against the Allies in many regards, like he kept his own intelligence network and often acted without informing them. To make matters even more complicated, there was also de Gaulle, who led his own armies. The two did create the French Committee of National Liberation to present a more unified front, but Giraud was outmaneuvered and eventually forced to step aside, leaving de Gaulle to run it alone. Hitler meanwhile reinforced Tunis, but this proved to be a costly mistake. Many of their best fighting men were lost for nothing there, as in May 1943, the city fell to the Allies. From here they would launch their invasion of Italy and bring about the fall of Mussolini. However, the French brought with them a number of African troops, and here many atrocities were committed. Like after the Battle of Monte Cassino, the Italian civilians were subject to mass rape by Moroccan soldiers. Although some Axis propaganda exaggerated the stories, it was concluded over 2,000 women were raped, the youngest at 11, the oldest at 86. Dozens died. 600 men suffered the same fate. Some, however, continue to put the number much higher than this, and thousands of other cases would also occur in occupied Germany as well. Although there were of course instances of abuse on all fronts, historian Norman Neymark claims that the numbers attributed to the Moroccans puts their crimes proportionally on the same level as those of the advancing Red Army. And sticking to this Red Army, in early 1943 they had crushed the Nazis at Stalingrad and moved on to liberate cities like Kursk. With the tide of the war now completely turned, the Allies held many conferences to discuss the future of the conflict and the post-war world. Most of these conferences took place in the Islamic world, like the Casablanca Conference, where the Allies decided that they would not allow the Germans to sue for peace, and they'd keep on fighting until they surrendered. Mohammed V attended the conference, as too did Charles de Gaulle. And, interestingly for North Africa, Roosevelt spoke in favour of independence, but said to the French, "The number of Jews engaged in the practice of professions, law, medicine, etc., should be definitely limited to the percentage of the Jewish population in North Africa." This plan would further eliminate the specific and understandable complaints which the Germans bore towards the Jews in Germany. There would be another conference over in Cairo, where Roosevelt and Churchill met Chiang Kai-shek late in the war to discuss their policies regarding Japan. There would then be another conference in Cairo shortly afterwards, where Churchill tried but failed to get a no-no of Turkey to enter into the conflict. Roosevelt, on the other hand, believed that Turkey was still too weak to defend themselves, and the loss of Turkey would prove to be too disastrous to the war effort. Inonu, though, did promise to join the war once he had fully rearmed. He also managed to come away with what he wanted. He had long feared Stalin's claims to the Straits and parts of Turkish lands, and Inonu got assurances from Britain and America that they would stand by them if the Soviets invaded. Possibly the most important conference took place in Tehran, though. Here, Stalin, Churchill and Roosevelt discussed Turkey's entry into the war and the possibility of giving them the Dodecanese and Crete. There were, of course, a number of other issues in Europe, like opening up another front to alleviate the pressure on the Russians. Plus, as the conference was in Tehran, they did decree that the war has caused special economic difficulties for Iran, and they all agreed that they will continue to make available to the government of Iran such economic assistance as may be possible. But this conference in Tehran may well not have taken place, as earlier in the year, Otto planned on starting a rebellion within Iran. Just like during the First World War, the Germans again targeted the Kashkai nomads as a potential ally. They then began flying in agents from their new bases in Russia and Ukraine. However, British intelligence quickly found out and arrested many of them. So, Operation France was a complete failure. But, according to Soviet intelligence, Otto Skorzeny had bolder plans with Operation Big Jump. Here he planned on leading a group of men himself in Iran and then assassinating or capturing the big three leaders. But the Western powers believed that this plan was a total Soviet fabrication. Yet, while the great powers were planning on dividing the world, there was a growing number of people who were demanding full independence. For instance, in February 1943, Ferhat Abbas published the Manifesto of the Algerian People, demanding to become an autonomous state in a federation with France. This state would also grant equality and freedoms to all religions. He had the support of prominent nationalists like Masali Haj, and they formed a political party, the Friends of the Manifesto and Liberty. But Charles de Gaulle rejected it outright. Otherwise, exiled Moroccan nationalists Boulefredj and Al-Farsi founded a brand new political party of their own, known as Istiklal. They too published their demands in the Proclamation of Independence of Morocco. This was first submitted to the Sultan, and they argued the allies who shed their blood for the cause of liberty stated in the Atlantic Charter that all peoples have the right to self-determination, to govern themselves by themselves. Moroccan independence was also seemingly supported by the Americans as well. For instance, even agreeing to hold a conference in Casablanca, according to historian Hassan Orid, recognized the Sultan's sovereignty over Morocco. The head of the French protectorate had not been invited to the dinner, further stressing the US position in terms of Morocco's independence. And according to the future king Hassan, Roosevelt said, 10 years from now, your country will be independent. Yet in Tunisia, Habib Bourguiba had been freed from prison, but rather than make his demands right away, he first fled to Cairo. More strangely though was the case of Libya. The Italians had been chased out of their colony, and now the French and the British divided their lands under their occupation. The British put most of their hopes in Idris, the leader of the Senussi. They believed that although he had lived in exile for many years, he still had a lot of influence in the country. He, after all, had created an army of Senussi exiles in Egypt to help the Allies, and held meetings with Libyan sheikhs to drum up support for his claims. In return for this in 1942, Anthony Eden promised that the Italians would be removed from Libya forever. But now, with the Italians gone, they needed to decide what to do next. Some like Hoya Miller put it bluntly, saying that they needed to be friendly with Italy and make us of her for our own purpose as a bastion of democracy in the Mediterranean, while Viscount Samuel Hood proposed handing Fezzan over to France in order to compensate them for their impeding losses in the Levant. So, in late 1944, RDH Arundel was sent to investigate the situation on the ground. He, like many others, saw a nation divided, with distinct identities in Cyrenaica and Tripolitania. Those in Cyrenaica he described as backward and ill-educated, while the majority of the population are semi-settled tent dwellers. The Cyrenaicans could not possibly stand alone. He also said that the region has no intrinsic value for a foreign power except for its geographical position, but again thought it could be turned into the western bastion of the Middle East. In his opinion, they were more open to welcoming Idris as a leader, and even would welcome the presence of British troops for economic reasons. Tripolitania, on the other hand, he argued, was more diverse and would fight against any return of Italian troops. But, he also said, most intelligent Tripolitanians realize that they cannot hope to stand alone. So, Libya could have been divided up again. As to who would protect them, he believed they would look to the east, to Egypt, the Levant and the Arab League, rather than to the west, and the shackles of French colonizing methods. And here he is referencing the recently created Arab League, which could well have united most of the Islamic world into a powerful state. The British and the French, though, continued to station troops in nations like Iraq and Syria. Prime Minister Nouri in Iraq largely remained on the Allied side, but in Syria, the pro-French Prime Minister, Taj al-Din al-Hassani, died in 1943, and this forced the French to call for an election. Prominent nationalist al-Atassi refused to stand, believing it would be seen as dealing with the French, but he did offer his support to Sukri al-Kuwatli, who was equally anti-French, having financed Syrian revolts since the 1920s. Then there was Lebanon, where Bachara al-Khoury came to power that same year. As a Maronite Christian, it may have been expected that he would continue to align with the French, but after serving many years in parliament, he founded the Constitutional Party and demanded independence. The French arrested him along with other nationalists like Riyad al-Sol and Camille Chamon, but protests erupted, they were freed, and they won the election that year. Importantly though, Khoury was a Christian, while Riyad al-Sol was a Muslim, and the country at that time was equally divided, with around 51% being Christian, 42% being Muslim, and the rest were Druze and the likes. So, to create unity, they drew up the National Pact. They agreed that the Christians should not align with the Europeans, and the Muslims should not champion unity with Syria. They also proposed that power be broken down by religion. So, the president should always be a Maronite, the Prime Minister a Sunni, the Speaker of Parliament a Shia, the Deputy Speaker a Greek Orthodox, while a Druze should be in control of the armed forces. This was expected to be a great achievement, with all sides uniting to share power, and initially it may be true, but Christians were given too much power, and over time Muslims would outnumber them, leading to a civil war decades later. But for now it held, and as soon as he won the election, Khoury declared independence and joined the calls for the formation of the Arab League. The Syrians, on the other hand, would have to wait until the British invade the country and demand that the French recognise their independence.